ladies and gentlemen. We're very excited to hear from the head of product at Shell Recharge Solutions Europe, Sarah Papamichalis. Hello. Sarah, welcome.
So if I may just start by saying well done to all of you. Normally the thank you goes at the end, but you are all here instead of having free wine outside. So thank you very much for that. Mariana mentioned that there are companies that take opportunities when there's a crisis. I can't imagine none of you are not doing the same thing. So I'm absolutely not taking any privilege here in saying that we have done just that, because we haven't. We're still doing it. We're nowhere near having done it yet. So I will give you a quick tip. I'm half English, half Greek. I see a few puzzled faces out there trying to work out where my accent actually connects with my surname. And I've lived in the Netherlands for 22 years, so apparently I also sound South African to some people because my accent has changed a bit more. If there are any South Africans in the audience, I do apologize. I'm just trying to explain my persona. So we're talking about personas here. You may be wondering why the head of product is standing up here and not the head of roaming. The head of roaming for Shell Recharge Solutions is sitting over there, and he will join me for the Q&A. So if you have any specific questions about roaming, don't worry, we will have a person who can actually help you answer those as well. You may also have questions for me. To be absolutely honest, whenever I go to conferences, I sometimes freeze whenever the moderators come up and say, hey, time for questions. There is an app, less embarrassing than trying to take a microphone, but quite frankly, what I'd be most interested in is what thoughts did I provoke? So if you can try and remember what thoughts did I provoke, I'd be more interested in hearing that. So throw them into the app or come and find me afterwards as well. Green, full forward. Right. So I have a question for you. Who knows who Shell Recharge Solution is? Hands in the air. Great. Because the first 3 slides I have are actually explaining who we are. And I have a riddle for you. The Sphinx said to Oedipus, Greek reference by the way, what actually walks on 4 legs when it's, four legs when it's young, 2 legs when it's old, and then back on 4 legs. Who knows the answer to that one? You can shout it out. It is man. I don't know who said it, but man. So I'm going to ask you a question, which is the connection to this. Which company has had 3 names, is actually a teenager, as old as the trees, but only 4 months old? And that's us. Okay? Shell Recharge Solutions. Some of you may know us as The New Motion. That was the first name in 2009. Then New Motion. And then basically in February, we rebranded as Shell Recharge Solutions. So basically, we are not alone anymore in our world of charging. Shell also bought a number of other companies, but Shell Recharge Solutions Europe is the part that I come from. And there's a Shell Recharge Solutions America, formerly known as Greenlots, for those of you who know who they are. So the AC capability and the DC capability coming together. So why do I say we're still a teenager? We're actually 13 years old. But we also act like teenagers. The people that I work with still have that passion to change eMobility. They have the passion to change what we're doing. They are, for some reason, still people there who have been here for 10 years, which in this industry is pretty amazing. I came from the corporate world before that, 11 years at Philips. I can't tell you the number of people who had already had their 10, 15, 20, 25-year anniversaries. But in our Shell Recharge Solutions Europe, we actually celebrated the first one last month. With a big party, by the way, because we're teenagers, so we like to do it the right way. The opportunity that we have right now is to tell you a story. So I'm not here to give you our product secrets or our product strategy. Unfortunately, there are competitors in the room as well. So my story will slightly be higher level than I would wish to do it. But basically, this is the story I'm here to tell. So from teenagers, we come to the classic world. Why have I put there a tree, a big tree, an old tree? Because in this industry, being 13 years old makes us old. It makes us really old. It means that we've built up a lot of knowledge It means that we're still learning as well, as the industry, of course, is changing, as we've heard from all the speakers today as well. But we're also a company which has a forest, right? We have multiple capabilities, and we've been growing rapidly as well. And I told you before, we're only 4 months old. We rebranded, which was an interesting, I have to say, a very interesting thing to do as a company which is 13-year-old, to rebrand, envision yourself. The mission statement changed. We are now much more firmly embedded in the Shell ecosystem, and that is because the Shell ecosystem has actually brought us a much wider part of capability building. So, in synopsis, this is who we are. I promise you there aren't that many corporate slides in here, so I have tried to keep them as limited as possible. But we're 13 years old, 13 years in charge, built by people who are passionate about changing eMobility, changing the face of what we were doing. Our HQ is in Amsterdam, but we actually have 6 offices in Europe. We also have offices in Asia. That's part of the Shell Recharge Solutions America and Asia's team. And we also have offices in America. And of course, a lot of people working remote all over the place now. 610 employees. When I joined, it was only 400. So that's huge growth in a very short period of time. And I'm talking a little bit about why that growth came about and how it came about a bit later. 35 nationalities, probably more by now, very, very diverse, and that actually helps us to actually bring everything we have together. Thunder's a little bit stolen by the moderator bringing in some of the topics I'm going to in, but what she's done is underpinned, right? The topic I'm about to talk about is a crisis. What is a crisis? I'll get to that in a second. And how does it actually manifest itself is another one. We all remember this one, the Suez Canal. Blocked for how many weeks? Can't remember either, but it was a lot. We also had the chip shortage. Yes, it's still going on. What we see and what we saw is the global, I would call it pond, rippling with one ripple effect after another. Because in our products, the chips are not the only things that became scarce. The plastics in the molds, component after component after component, disappearing from the market. So guess what happens when issues happen in the supply chain? People look at procurement to solve it with purchasing, but they also look at product to work out how are we going to solve this problem. And that's why I'm here telling you the story of the crisis, etc. But here's the thing about a crisis. In the medical world, the term crisis is actually quite an easy one to decide, right? You have a heart attack or a stroke. There's something happens. In this crisis, as she mentioned before, we layered one thing on top of the other. Typhoon in China, chip manufacturing factory shut down in China or burnt down in China. We had the Suez Canal. We have scarce components, we have scarce, all sorts of things have become much harder to find. On top of that, we have the geopolitical issues. We all know about Ukraine, but guess what? Taiwan and China right now are doing all sorts of posturing. We already see radical changes, maybe not so radical, but we already see Apple announcing last week that they're moving some of their manufacturing to Vietnam, looking at dual sourcing, looking at all sorts of different ways where we may end up trying to mitigate the crisis, or a crisis. On top of that, energy, inflation. The Queen of England died this week, which means the Bank of England couldn't actually increase its inflation rates this week. There are so many things that keep on happening that we're actually in an age where the crisis is just becoming normal. Are there any McKinsey consultants in the room? I'm about to give a compliment, believe it or not. No? Okay, well, there's a really, really interesting article, if I remember it correctly. It's called Strategic Courage in the Face of Volatility. Worst title you could ever come across for what is actually an amazing article. So if you want me to repeat it later, I will try and remember it, but otherwise I will repeat it at the end of this. Really, really good article. Because when I was reading it, I realized that we did exactly the same things that all companies do when they're faced with a crisis. You go into planning mode, you go into control mode, you try and actually take control of the things that you control of. You plan, plan, plan. We already heard from the first presentation this morning that actually when you're in scale-up and there's problems and there's all sorts of different issues that you have to solve, it's actually plan goes out the window. I think he mentioned it's a 2-year plan. Well, quite frankly, we were going week by week at one point because things kept changing. 12 steps forward, 5 steps back, 4 steps forward, 1 step back, and then a leap in advance where we thought we had the whole problem contained and controlled, and then all of a sudden we started all over again. So quite frankly, we have had a huge amount of turbulence, which we couldn't control. So then we started thinking, what can we do about this? And this is when I want to talk about the next part of this. I actually had a picture of boiling frogs, which I had to remove. So let me explain the boiling frogs analogy. Does everybody know the boiling frogs analogy? No, right. In the 1800s, apparently, because I had to Google it, some scientists claim to have done an experiment where you put frogs in a bowl or a pot, and you start gradually increasing the heat. Theoretically, those frogs die a slow death because they never jump out of the hot, because it never gets hot enough to basically actually make them jump out. This, by the way, by all sorts of amphibian specialists, has been debunked, but the analogy stays that if we're in a big enough crisis and the heat goes up slowly enough, we will not realize and actually will not react to the crisis that we're facing. So at one point, we are faced with a crisis. At one point, we go as an organization, enough is enough, we now need to stop. We now need to think about things differently. And that is where the product team were faced with as well. And that's why I'm standing here to tell you the story. I'm sure all of us have similar stories, so apologies for telling ours right now. This is the opportunity. Believe it or not, I'm not talking. I'm letting you absorb those 2 words. 125 million electric vehicles by 2030 from the 10 million of today. Right? So the opportunity is big. All of these crises that we have been living through have actually created a big change in consumer behavior. Right? We talked a little bit, well, I didn't, but they did, the people who were on the stand just now and the ones before that, a little bit about the changing personas. BMW mentioned their customers and how they're reacting. There was a joke about the grandparents, but quite frankly, the energy crisis, which hits the pockets, is the one that's probably going to be the tipping to basically move more people into green energy, whether that's solar panels, whether that's actually cars, whether that's electric scooters, electric bikes. Governments are all behind it. They're giving out, well, I don't know how many different ways of actually making money and actually getting money back to try and encourage people. So the opportunity is there. But how on earth do we, as a relatively small teenager, but actually ancient and actually new, actually win that battle? There are 3 things that we've done. And it's really easy to show them on 3 slides. It is not easy to express the pain. It is not easy to express the frustration. It is not easy to show the sheer dedication of all the people who I'm representing here, by the way, who actually have done most of the work. But one thing we've done is we've unlocked our ecosystem. Those of you who knew NewMotion, or the NewMotion, depending on which variant and flavor you knew from the past, will actually know that we had a locked ecosystem. We developed our own charge points. We had our own CPMS. We are a CPO network operator as well. We have our own MSP. We have the whole ecosystem. But what we've been forced to do is actually look at our ecosystem and look at the trends in the market. And we have now unlocked it, or in the process of unlocking it as well. This is not just because of the crisis, but the crisis has actually forced us to make strategic decisions at leadership team level, at Shell level, at product level, at all the levels that you can imagine, to basically make sure that we can do this unlocking. And the why of that is very simple. More and more charge points are getting old. We have thousands which basically have no connectivity anymore because the subscriptions have lapsed. People have moved houses. That's just in the home domain. In the business domain, a lot of companies have changed management systems. So one business site may have 10 of this, 20 of that, 50 of this, 11 of that. And we now need to actually work with those and make sure that we can partner accordingly. The second thing we're doing is building new capabilities. I cannot underpin how easy it is to say that word and actually how hard it is to do. Because when are you done? When is your capability built? when does it become business as usual? It's very easy to define it up front what you think it's going to be, but it's actually very difficult to say we've got there. So what we're talking about here is new skills. The new motion was known for AC. We're now doing DC. We're doing fleet depot. We're moving into all of the areas that basically cover the whole ecosystem, because that is also how we're actually going to grow. New teams have been set up, new ways of working, mentioned before as well during the day, new governance models, new processes. All of this requires the running train, if I may be so bold. The Japanese speed bullet, as we used to call it, is going as fast as it's going, and at the same time, we're trying to build capability alongside it. I'm sure all of you recognize this. This is not my pitch on why we're in a wonderful world of an ecosystem with Shell. This slide is purely here to tell you that the only way we could do this, if it will go back, this, is by using this. So we now have teams who are working around the clock, not because we've set up 24/7 development capabilities in Amsterdam, but because we have our teams in LA developing some parts of the ecosystem. We have teams in India developing other parts of the ecosystem. We have DC capabilities, which we brought over, and we're taking AC capabilities over to LA. So basically, just from a very, very singular way, we're changing how we work together. To be absolutely honest, when we were brought together, I actually felt like it was being thrown into a playground and say, go play, right? We'd never met each other. COVID was happening. We had calls, but there was no big trust. They're in LA. We're over here, which basically means we have 1.5 hours to talk to each other every day if they get up at 7 and if we go to bed at 7. So basically, there was the ability to co-create and to work together was very limited. So December of last year, 7 of us flew over to LA with really wondering whether we were going to get back or get stuck there with COVID for Christmas, and basically came together to start working out plans. These are not my children, but they could be. My children always used to say, are we there yet? Grumpy. The organization that I'm in says the same, because we are there, but we're not there yet. A lot of what we have done is to build the capability, start decoupling, as I mentioned before, add in all sorts of services, and actually remake and rethink our proposition. One area where we failed, do you know why the kids always ask this? Is because they're not in control of the destination and they don't know when they get there. We also have had issues. Sometimes we shared too much of joy or frustration, and sometimes we didn't share enough. So the organization often said, are we there yet? When do we have control? This is basically now the vision of the future. Us working across all different segments and basically offering EV solutions. A lot of those capabilities already exist. Some of them we're still building. Partners are here as well. I've already seen quite a few of you. An opportunity is now arising to do things differently. I'm now at 13 seconds before the end. Ta-da. How about that for timing? Thank you. I don't only mean for not being out there drinking wine, but there are a lot of people also online who are actually the people who are doing all of the work. So I'd like to say thank you to them as well, and thank you to you too. 7 seconds, and I'm done. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. I think you're the only one who was so spot-on punctual with your presentation, but that leaves us then enough time to get some questions from our participants.
And I'd love to get Francois up here to introduce him.
Please do. So
he's mic'd up and ready to go too.
So is our app ready?
So while they're getting
Hi, Francois, welcome. Hello. Okay, so we have a question from Judy. Interesting that you use an analogy that has been debunked. There is a climate crisis ongoing, and instead of waiting too long, most companies and people actually take action and change their behavior, like a frog actually would. And one of the few parties not taking action in time is, in fact, Shell. She finds ironic. So how do you see the role of Shell Recharge to convince Shell to change?
I love the question. I don't know who you are, Judy, but well done. You've spot on in certain areas. The only reason I'm standing here is because I believe joining the new Motion, and now Shell Recharge Solutions, will change the big oil companies. Oil and gas, sorry. The only reason a lot of the people that we have in our company have joined, and I'm talking about 200 people have joined since I joined myself, that's a lot of people, is because they believe that we can change these big companies from the inside. I've sat on a lot of interviews recently, and every single interview I sit on, I ask the same question: why do you want to join us? Those people who tell me they just want to be part of a big company never make the cut. The people who say, I'm here to change big companies, I'm here to change the world we live in, those are the people who move to the next interview. What you're seeing is a big strategy. I'm used to big execs coming and going, to be honest. What we now have is the same VP who actually came up with the strategy for the eMobility 7 to 8 years ago, and he's still here now. We're still investing in companies, we're still changing from the inside, and he's the one who's influencing up, and we're influencing him up. So I don't know where you are, Judy, but thank you very much for your question. I apologize if the frogs analogy was the wrong one, but I actually indeed mentioned that it was a debunked myth, but it was more to talk about a topic and an analogy. I don't know where you are, but thank you.
All right. Shall we move on to a next question? That's from Peter. He writes, could you elaborate on why Shell Recharge is sticking with a fixed fee roaming tariff per kilowatt hour, and with this basically limiting the asset owner from asking for a tariff that matches the costs of their energy contract? That's the question for Francois.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a good question, and I also have to look a bit back. Roaming has been established a long time ago, so did our roaming interconnection. And what you see, a flat rate for roaming tariffs, is something which was working well in the past. And I guess it is fairly right that due to the changes in energy prices, the deviation between energy prices, that certain new needs are arising, and it's definitely something where we are looking in today.
I have nothing to add.
Okay.
That's why I said you have a specialist here as well.
Thank you very much. I think we do have a couple of more questions. Yes. So Luke is asking, can you be more specific of what you mean with unlocking the ecosystem? To whom and what exactly?
Yep. So I think I mentioned it, but let me say it again. We used to have a locked ecosystem. Our charge points worked with our backend, our CPMS. Our app was related to our products only. And what we're now doing is unlocking all of that, and many, many more as well. I don't know where you are, Luke, but I'm happy to discuss that. So by unlocking it, it means that we're looking at our backend, so the CPMS, and actually adding in there different charge points. We're doing that with DC, we're doing that with AC as well. Equally so with the charge points. They need to start working with different front ends as well, because we have now got to a point where all things need to integrate. That came up again and again and again today. I'm also going to go back to the other comment I made about the different companies that we're now sister companies with and brother companies with. That is also part of the ecosystem. So Sonnen is a battery company. Ubertricity, as you may know, has all sorts of products, lamppost charging, they have on-the-go charging. There's so much of the ecosystem that we now belong to that it's not just about us going out and finding partners, but actually using and working with. So what you'll see is more propositions that bring those things together. We're already working with a lot of companies from our own perspective, but actually you'll see more propositions and integrated offers coming together as well. I don't know if that answered the question. I hope so.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple more. So Sam asks, at what price point for charging versus gasoline do you see a risk to EV adoption growth?
You want to get that?
Yeah, shall I get it? It's a very nice question. It's also a very difficult question, especially to answer it in a generic way, as it will be very different from person to person, depending whether it's only a focus on economic, on price, or whether other elements are being taken into account. So I think there is much more to driving EV, to charging your EV and using energy for mobility than only the price. So the risk for growth, it might hamper a bit, but at the end, I think it's definitely the way forward.
I think we have time maybe for one last question that was sent in earlier. And someone asked, the hardware CP market is very fragmented in most EU countries with very different players and local regulation. So how do you expect the market will evolve in the coming years as we head towards mass adoption? So a nice way to end is to look out into the future.
Yeah. So one thing that hasn't come up today, which came up a little bit, is the regulations. Right? So somebody mentioned the smart charging regulations of the UK. Mensen-Eichrecht in Germany has come up, I think, at least once. What hasn't come up is the European community, right? So we now have Mensen-Eichrecht in Germany, we have AFIR, which is the European community version of these regulations, we have smart charging regulations in the UK, but also elsewhere. What I actually see is a humongous change needed for these regulations. I mention that because there was a big discussion on the panel before. I wish I could have jumped up and joined in, because quite frankly, the interpretation of those regulations is indeed one of the biggest issues that we have right now. So in terms of the charge point hardware, there will be more and more either niche players needed or mass regulations, because as charge point manufacturers, it's almost impossible to keep on creating different flavors of charge points. So we will, it was mentioned before as well, as everybody is, look at the Tesla model, look at ChargePoint as a physical product where you get software upgrades to maintain and change it. So I think that's where everybody will go, which I think the CEO of Star Church also mentioned.
Thank you very much. We're right on time. Sarah and Francois, pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.